a preview of the Civil War. These notes are going to be talking about the advantages and disadvantages of the North and the South, who wins, why do they win, how does the war start. Lincoln takes office. If you remember from our last set of notes, the election of 1860 elected Lincoln, a Republican, the first Republican to be the president, but many Southern states don't vote for him. And so when he gets elected, 7 Southern states immediately secede. We can see them in the yellow on this map: South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. They believe that Lincoln is an abolitionist. None of them voted for him, and so they said, fine, we're done. We're not going to have this Republican as our president. So when Lincoln takes office, he understands that 7 states have already seceded. Others are thinking about secession. We see in brown, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. We call these the Upper South. They're taking a wait-and-see approach. They don't know if Abraham Lincoln is an abolitionist, so they want to see what he does when he takes office. Then we have another group of Southern states that are called the border states. They're in green on this map: Missouri, Kentucky, what will be West Virginia, not quite a state yet, Maryland, and Delaware. They're also taking a wait-and-see approach. And so Lincoln, when he comes into Washington, D.C. and gives his inaugural address, it's a very important speech. All of these upper southern states in brown and the border states in green, they're thinking about secession, but they want to see what Lincoln has to say. And so Lincoln knows this. So in his speech, he has to reassure these southern states that have not yet seceded that he will not take away slavery. So if we look at a portion of his first inaugural address, he says, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists." So this is Lincoln's FreeSoil ideology, right? He says that I don't like slavery, but I'm not going to stop slavery where it exists. He says it clear as day here. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Lincoln is trying to reassure the border and upper southern states, don't secede. I'm not going to get rid of slavery, so calm down. Now, the next part of his speech, he's trying to woo those yellow states that have already ceded back into the Union. And so he's trying to think of a way that I can convince them that they should come back to us. And so he says to these yellow states that have already seceded, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break the bonds of affection between North and South. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of union, when again touched by the better angels of our nature." Lincoln is reminding the Southerners that we have fought wars together. If you can see the Patriot Grave part of this, we fought the Revolution together. We fought the War of 1812 together. We fought the Mexican-American War together. We are a country. Stay with us. Come back. Listen to the better angels of your nature. Listen to that angel on your shoulder that is preaching calm instead of the other one who's preaching violence. He's trying to get the Southern states to come back. Of course, the Deep South, those yellow states, will not come back. And we see the first skirmish of the Civil War happen not too long after Lincoln's first inaugural address. It happens at Fort Sumter, South Carolina. In the map, you see, in the very bottom, you see the little tiny star. It says Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is a United States fort. It is on an island in the middle of Charleston Harbor. So the rest of this map is all the state of South Carolina, and they have seceded from the Union, and they want the North out of the Fort Sumter. From South Carolina's viewpoint, they say this is our new country, this is our port, we should have control of it, and they know they can have control of it as long as the North controls this very strategic location, Fort Sumter. It controls the people who come in and out of the fort. And so South Carolina says to Lincoln and the North, get out of our fort. So Lincoln is facing his first crisis as president. If he does what the South says and he withdraws Northern troops from Fort Sumter, he looks weak. And he certainly doesn't want to look weak first taking over the presidency. But if he sends more reinforcements and if he sends ammunition to hold on to the fort, well, he'll look like the aggressor. And then he's afraid that those border states, those upper South states, will secede, also widening the war. And so what does Lincoln do? Lincoln decides that he will just send food and medical supplies. This way he doesn't look like the aggressor, and he certainly is not giving up the fort. Well, that is not good enough for South Carolina. They want Lincoln and the North out of the fort, and so in April of 1861, they bombard the fort. And this begins the Civil War, because for the first time, southern states are firing and attacking on a northern military location. So the battle happens all day long. Eventually, at the end of the day, Fort Sumter, the northern fort, does surrender. We see not the stars and stripes flying over the fort, but we see the stars and bars, the southern flag. And so the very first battle of the war, or skirmish, goes in favor of the South. But it's not so much about the battle that makes this important, it's what it does. Like I said, it starts the Civil War. In addition to that, the Upper South decides to secede. Those brown states on that map, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, those southern states decide to secede. They now know a war is going to happen. There will be no compromise, and they just can't fight against their southern brothers in South Carolina and Mississippi. And so, as a result of Fort Sumter, not only does the war start, but more southern states secede. There becomes this big patriotic rush now on both sides, North and South, to join the army and get ready for all-out war. Next, a family squabble. This section is primarily about what we call the border states. If you can see on the map, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, those are the primary ones. And they're all southern states, and they would all like to leave the Union and join their fellow southern states. So let's deal with these a little bit at a time. The first one is Maryland. In the top right-hand corner, you see a close-up of Maryland, and Lincoln cannot let Maryland secede because inside of Maryland is our national capital, Washington, D.C., and it's not very good form to start a war and then immediately lose your capital. And so Lincoln rushes whatever northern troops we have at the start of the war, he rushes them to Maryland, and he physically holds on to Maryland. So we see that the border states, it's very important that they stay in. Lincoln is afraid of losing them, not just because they control the capital, but if we look at Kentucky and also Maryland on the other map, the map on the left, we can see on this map that the darker areas represent high population densities. Kentucky and Maryland both have large populations of white people. And if they were to join the South, then the Southerners would have more people in their army. So Lincoln desperately wants to hold on to the border states, not just because that it has our capital, but also there's a good deal of people in Kentucky and Maryland. And also, Kentucky and Maryland have industry. They have manufacturing. The rest of the South does not have this. And so Lincoln realizes if he can keep Maryland and Kentucky from joining the South, not only will he deprive them of a large population that they could use for their military, but he will also deprive them of any industry they could use. So for Lincoln, keeping the border states in is paramount. And so here we have a quote, same category. Lincoln says, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." For Lincoln, he makes it very clear at the start of the war that the Civil War is not about freeing slaves. The Civil War is about restoring the Union, keeping the country together. Why does he say this? Of course, Lincoln later on is going to free the slaves, but why at the start of the war is he very clear about saying this war is about keeping the country together, it is not about slavery? It's because of the border states. If Lincoln frees the slaves, if he says this war is about freeing the slaves, then Kentucky and Maryland and Missouri will leave. They are slave states. And Lincoln, I've already talked about why it's so important to him to keep the border states in. So it's important that you know this, that at the start of the war, Lincoln says the war is about restoring the Union, and as the war goes on, we'll talk about freeing slaves later, and we'll talk about why he issues the Emancipation Proclamation and his goal for the war changes. Next, advantages and disadvantages. So this section is all about who should win the war and why. Who has more advantages? So the first one is home turf, home field advantage. The war is primarily, as you can see on this map, it shows you battles by county. The Civil War is primarily going to be fought in the South. The reason being is because the South has seceded, and so Lincoln says you cannot secede, and so he has to invade the South and bring them back into the country. To do that, Lincoln has to go on the offensive, which means he needs more troops. The South just has to fight a defensive war, which means they need less troops, which is good for the South. That's an advantage for the South because they don't have as many people as the North. And so having the war fought in the South is an advantage in one aspect because they can just have fewer men. There is another advantage, too, is that the South is being invaded. So the Southerners are going to fight very hard to protect their homes, their families, their businesses, their farms. And so the Southern troops are known for their courage, for their willingness to give up their lives because they are fighting for their home. And so we see that's also an advantage for the South. Next, leadership. Well, there's two kinds of leadership, political leadership and military leadership. So let's start with military leadership. I've given you some pictures of different generals in this war. The two you definitely need to know on this slide is Robert E. Lee in the top left. He's going to be the top Confederate general. And then Ulysses S. Grant in the bottom right. He eventually is going to be the top Union general. So at the start of the war, most of our top generals in the United States Army will resign their commissions and go join the Southern Army. The reason for this is because prior to the Civil War, it was considered that that's what a plantation owner's son did. He went to West Point, he went to the Virginia Military Institute, he joined the Army, and that was what just a gentleman did. And so when the war starts, all of these officers in the United States Army, they're Southerners, and so they resign their commissions and they fight for the South. So immediately the South has an advantage fighting in the war because they just have better generals. Robert E. Lee is the best example of this. Like I said, he's on the top left. He is a Virginian, and Lincoln goes to Lee and he says, look, I hear you're a very good general, a very good leader. I would like to give you control of the Northern Army. Lee is flattered, but he turns Lincoln down because he says, I cannot fight against my country. I cannot fight against Virginia. I cannot fight against my fellow Southerners. And so he goes and he joins the Southern Army. And for years, he will confound the North. He is a much better general than anybody the North has from 1861 to 1863. On the right-hand side, we see Grant. Grant is going to be our best general in the war, but at the start of the war, he's not even in the Army. He had trouble with drinking. He wasn't in the Army. He was working for his father in Illinois, his father-in-law. And so when the war starts, it's going to take him a while to rise through the ranks and eventually be successful enough to be put in charge of the Northern Army to go against Lee. And so eventually the North does find their general, Grant, to combat Lee, but it's not until 1864. So the early advantage in generalship goes to the South. Next, political leadership. Who has the advantage here? And this is definitely the North. The North has Abraham Lincoln. The South has Jefferson Davis on the left. And Lincoln, even if he wasn't a better leader, which he is, he already has an advantage because the North has a strong government. Lincoln has a strong federal government, and he can raise taxes, the first income tax in American history, to raise money to support the military. Jefferson Davis can't do that. He's head of a confederation, and so he can only ask the southern states for money. Lincoln can say to the states, I need more men, you have to give me more men for the army. Jefferson Davis can't do that. He's head of a confederacy again. He can just ask the states for men. And so we see Lincoln has a decided advantage just because he's working with a stronger central government. Manufacturing. This certainly is a northern advantage. As you can see from this map in blue, those are areas with heavy concentrations of industry. The North has, and by some estimates, 500% more manufacturing than the South does. Of course, this is going to help them in the war because they're able to produce cannons and mortars and gunpowder in much bigger quantities than the South. The South primarily is based on agriculture and cotton growing, so the South won't be able to compete with the North militarily. Now, why on earth would the South declare war on the North? Where are they going to get all of these manufactured goods? And of course, the South believes in King Cotton. They believe that they can sell their cotton to England, which is a very heavy industrial country, and that's where they're going to get their war materials. To keep this from happening, Lincoln, we'll talk about this more later, Lincoln is going to start blockading the South. He's going to send the United States Navy down to southern ports and try to stop them trading their cotton to England for cannons and war goods. At the start of the war, this is not very successful. The Northern Navy is just too small. But as we get into 1863, 1864, we see that the Northern Navy becomes much bigger. The North makes more ships, much more effective, and we put a stranglehold on the South. And eventually the North wins the Civil War just because they simply have more people. They have more manufactured goods, and the South runs out. Transportation, definite advantage for the North. As you can see on the map on the left, the North has thousands of miles more of railroad track. They're able to produce manufactured goods and get them to the front. They're able to send reinforcements to the front, food to the front. And the South, with fewer railroads, just can't do this. In fact, when the North invades the South, they will tear up, as you can see in the image, they will tear up as many railroads in the South as they can, further weakening the Southern economy and the Southern war effort. Population. As I mentioned just a few slides ago, the North has many more people. We can see in black on this map, those are urban areas of over 25,000 people, and the North, whether it's Boston or New York City or Philadelphia, they just have bigger cities, more people. And so when the war is fought, the North seems to have this inexhaustible supply of manpower, and the South, by the time we get to 1865, just simply, literally runs out of men. Next, money. We don't see it on the map, but you could almost think about this in terms of banking. It's the same thing. The North has most of the banks in the country, the big banks, banks in New York City, banks in Boston. We see that that's where the money of America is. That's where the investors are. That's where the manufacturing is. And so the North is able to pay for the war much better than the South. And so the South runs out of money. Next, King Cotton loses to King Corn. So this slide is all about the South's best hope for winning the Civil War. They think that they can get England to give them, if not military troops, if not send army troops to the South, at least give them all the manufacturing they need. And so that's the South's hope for winning this war, get England involved. They think that England will do this because we know that the government and the businessmen of England need the South. They need the South's cotton for their manufacturing. And so the South believes that England will come to their aid because they are so dependent on Southern cotton. But like I said, this slide shows you why that doesn't happen. The first reason is because during this time frame from 1861 to 1865, England has a series of poor harvests. They run out of food to feed their people. And the only place they can get this food is the North. The North grows tons of extra corn. And so England has to decide, do we openly aid the South to get their cotton, so we have manufacturing jobs, or do we keep our distance from the South and not openly aid them so we can still continue to get northern corn? And England decides to feed their people rather than to have jobs for their people. And so England keeps their distance from the South. They do give them some aid, but they don't give them open aid. They don't send troops because they're afraid that the North just won't sell them the corn they need to feed their people. Next, England is a heavily abolitionist country. They've been this way ever since the 1830s, really, but it even made more so by Uncle Tom's Cabin when people read it in England. And so the people of England are abolitionists. Now, as we will find out later on in the war, in 1863, Lincoln reverses his stance, and he says that the war is no longer just about keeping the country together, it's also about freeing the slaves. When he does this, and we'll talk more about that later, but when he does this, when he officially makes the war also about freeing the slaves, that shuts the door on English participation in the Civil War. The government of England, the businessmen of England would like to support the South, but the people of England won't let them do it. When Lincoln says that this war is about ending slavery, the abolitionists of England, the people of England, just won't let their government actively support the South because now they see the South as fighting for slavery. And so this abolitionist group in England just won't let England support the South. Next. We see England also doesn't need the South as much as the South thought because England starts to ramp up cotton production in some of their colonies around the world. At this point, England's own Egypt and they own India, and they just get their cotton from there. And so the South, as the war goes on, becomes less and less important to the English economy. So no reason to support the South. Lincoln and civil liberties. Civil liberties are your constitutional rights, mostly your First Amendment rights that says you have the right to freedom of speech, the press, religion, etc. Now, during the war, there's a lot of Northerners who do not support the war. Mostly they are the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party sees that the Civil War is the Republican Party's problem. They blame Lincoln for the Civil War. They see it's destructive to the country. And so we have these Democrats called peace Democrats. They start to encourage people. They go on street corners and they say, don't sign up for the military. Now, Lincoln can't let this happen. If the peace Democrats get their way and people don't sign up for the military, or they don't go when they're drafted into the military, then we're going to run out of troops. And so Lincoln needs to find a way of shutting these people up. And so what Lincoln does is he starts arresting people who are advocating to oppose the war. He suspends Democratic-controlled newspapers. He suspends freedom of the press. He takes away the writ of habeas corpus, writ W-R-I-T, of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is the idea that as an American you have the right to a trial where evidence will be presented against you. The government just can't throw you in jail and leave you there. Lincoln suspends this. He says, look, we're in an emergency. I don't have time to put all these people on trial. I just want to shut them up. And so he throws them in jail, and he locks them in jail and throws away the key, and he doesn't give them a trial. The best example of this is a gentleman named Clement Vallandigham. Clement is a peace Democrat, and he actively goes out there and gives speeches saying, don't support the war, don't support Lincoln, don't pay your taxes, don't join the draft. And so Lincoln arrests him. His only crime is that he spoke out against the war. And then he puts him in jail, and then eventually he exiles him from America. And so he's a great example of Lincoln's persecution and suspension of people who are against the war. Now, we call these peace Democrats Copperheads. Copperheads it's taken off of a name for a very poisonous little snake found in the East Coast, and so this is certainly not a nice name to call these people. But if you ever see the term Copperhead, you know they're anti-war peace Democrats. Another way that Lincoln attacks civil liberties is he starts to issue the draft. In late 1862, early 1863, the United States government starts to run out of volunteers for the military. Young men realize that I could die in this war, and so they're not as keen to go out and sign up for the army. And so Lincoln has to start the draft, or conscription. And so the draft is where the government, they pick a number, they pick your number, and they pick your name, and they say, okay, you're in the military, even if you don't want to be. And so we see this as an imposition of people's civil liberties. Now, Lincoln, of course, says that this is needed, and perhaps it is, but we can lump into this category of the government infringing upon your civil liberties. Now, can Jefferson Davis do this, Lincoln's counterpart in the Confederacy? He really can't. Jefferson Davis is going to have a tough time suppressing anti-war movements in the South. There are a few, simply because he doesn't have a strong federal government that he can use to get rid of civil liberties.